The 1830s and 40s in Europe was a time of massive upheaval and difficulties. And we also see during this period not only the effects of industrialization spreading across Europe with other countries like the German-speaking countries and France and Belgium beginning to industrialize, which you have to understand was quite opposed by a great number of the old-line conservatives who realized the amount of social upheaval and disharmony that this caused. It also brings with it, of course, the rise of new classes, middle class and upper class and wealthy commoners, people who want access to political power and will use the ideology of liberalism to try to gain entrance into society, into power, into the power structure. And of course, it also brings with it quite a number of issues like a population increase, increased migration, both between areas in countries, between countries in Europe themselves, and also, of course, quite a bit of immigration to America. Part of the upheaval had to do with the population outstripping the food supply, especially in places that were under outside control, like, for example, Ireland, which had a very massive death rate from 1845 to 1848 or so because the Irish peasants were reduced to living on potatoes. Most of the grain and the foods that they were raising actually were imported to England. And of course, all of England in this period was under the control of the British. British imperialism certainly was a factor in Ireland. And so the British would actually confiscate food from the Irish, and they didn't have anything to eat, and they died in the millions. Those many of them, of course, immigrated to America, but quite a number of them actually died quite terrible and painful deaths. And they were those who couldn't pay their British landlords were driven off the land. And the British purposely confiscated grain, knowing that the Irish had nothing to eat because of the blight on the potato crop, and allowed them to die in great numbers to try to actually, cleanse Ireland of them as much as possible. So it was quite a time of upheaval. The wage labor also is a factor in this period, the construction of railroads too, of course, because of markets. But on 519, there's a discussion of the concept known as proletarianization, the process of becoming wage laborers. That was happening both to agricultural workers, many of whom, of course, were rootless and driven off the land because of the end of imperialism and the rationalization of agricultural production, the fencing off of areas, the closing down of commons where peasants could raise their own food crops for sale or consumption and things like that. But also, most people up to this period in history, of course, were skilled artisans, which means that they had training in a special set of skills. Many of them belonged to a guild. Of course, the guilds are pretty much out of the way by now. And they also owned their own tools, their own shops, control the hours of work that they put in, and really were in charge of their own lives. And they got the full profit from the sale of the commodity that they produced. Under wage labor, of course, another person, a capitalist or a group of capitalists, own the land, they own the means of production, they own the tools, they also control the working hours and the lives of the people who work there. And of course, under wage labor, a laborer does not get the full proceeds of the profit from the sale of the commodity that he or she produces. They get a portion of it in form of a wage, whereas the most of the profit is actually accumulated by the capitalists for further investment and speculation and so forth. And this process, as you can imagine, caused quite a bit of resentment on behalf of workers who were given a wage that was barely enough to subsist on for all the way up into the 20th century. Early 20th century, it was very common for the whole family, including the women and children, to have to work to survive, especially, of course, among immigrant families to different areas, because they were always given the lowest wages. So this resentment caused a great demand for social reform and for democracy, actually. And just like the liberal class developed the ideology of liberalism to legitimate their demands and their claims for social reform and entry into politics and the power structure, in Europe in this period and in Americas too, working class people began to, in considerable numbers, to adhere to the idea of socialism. So we see how that socialism was the development in chapter 21 of the working classes and the peasants and the poor being denied representation and entry into the political structure. In most of the world in this period, America being one of the few exceptions in the 1830s onwards, but in most of the world in this period, you had to own property to be able to vote or to run for office. So this is why they were demanding the expansion of the democratic suffrage, of the representation and so forth. So on page 522, we read about the Chartist movement in the late 1830s. A group of artisans who were sliding down the class ladder and going into wage labor put together the Chartist movement. They wrote a charter for 6 specific reforms, including universal male suffrage, all males can vote, annual election of the House of Commons, secret ballot, equal electoral districts, and the abolition of property qualifications for and the payment of salaries to members of the House of Commons. What was the salaries about? Well, political salaries are generally kept low so that people who don't have a lot of money can't afford to be politicians. Only wealthy people can afford to live on that small amount of money. So they were demanding higher wages so that the workers and the poor could actually serve in office. This was, of course, brought up in the House of Commons many times. They wanted democratic reform and the peaceful transition to a more democratic society. It's the first large-scale political movement by the working class, organized by the working class, and it constantly failed. It was never voted on in the House of Parliament, even though it was presented several times. So this causes quite a number of the Chartists to become more radical. When you're denied entry into power, when you are locked out of the political process and denied representation, you generally radicalize and look to not necessarily get into that power structure anymore, but to overturn it and set up a new one. And that certainly is a lot about what socialism is about. Socialism also comes about because of some other measures taken. The family certainly was changed by the Industrial Revolution, as we see on page 523 and 24. And, of course, it's important to note on 525 and 6 that the modern metropolitan police force was basically put together to prevent any kind of social upheaval. It was put in place by a political and economic elite in Europe, which was very anxious to protect the existing social order with them on top and also to protect their property. So the modern police force was meant to primarily police the poor and the working class, and also to protect the property of the wealthy from the depredations of the poor. So it's no accident that police forces were put in place in this period. And of course, most of the laws on the books actually deal with property crimes more than crimes against property more than anything else. So there was a discussion about economics on 526 to 27, classical economics. People like Thomas Malthus, David Ricardo, trying to systematically understand this process of capital accumulation and social change which comes out of it. Of course, the idea of laissez-faire, the invisible hand of the marketplace, all those things came about from Adam Smith and Ricardo and other people onwards. Malthus, it's important to note, was quite pessimistic. He believed that wages would always be kept low because a rise in wages would cause a betterment of the lives of the working class, and they could afford to eat more, so therefore the population would increase and the population would outstrip the food supply. So there are still neo-Malthusians today who are concerned about population. Of course, not everyone that's concerned about population is Malthusian, but nevertheless, that's still something that people discuss. There was very little reform in this period, and the demand for democracy, of course, was not met. The demand for broadening of democracy was not met because Europe in this period is still under that period of the Congress of Vienna and the Quadruple Alliance of trying to prevent the spread of democratic ideas. So when people are locked out of the political process, they develop new political ideologies, and that certainly is a lot of what socialism is all about. There's 2 different types of socialism. The first is on 528, it's utopian socialism. And then, of course, there is Marxism, or as Marx referred to it, scientific socialism. Marx, towards the end of his life, said, "I am no Marxist," because he did not like what people were doing to his ideas. There's also a third variant of these ideas, and that is anarchism, which we will look at in the next lecture.